Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Saturday, October the 4th, and we are live in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn. Thank you for joining us today for Justice in America presents Exposing the Great Society with Rob Rosselli. Rob Rosselli is an author and an avid researcher. He has been on many podcasts throughout the nation and is a voice of truth. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I'd like to present to some and introduce to others none other than Mr. Rob Rosselli.
Hey Marshall, how are you? And thanks for having me. I greatly appreciate everything you've done for me and my new brother in Christ, Marshall. So he set this all up, and I understand this is going to be a low-tech presentation. I'm not very tech savvy, but anyway, let's get into it. So we're going to talk about the so-called conspiracy that people, which basically is another term for reality. I mean, conspiracy, I guess the definition is anything that disagrees with the government narrative or the so-called experts, whatever we're going to call them, but we're going to get into all that. And let me just say this, and excuse me, this is my general outline, it's backwards, but basically what it says is the Bible is the core of the conspiracy. It's just that simple. I know there's other, conspiracy theorists out there that talk about the Illuminati and the Federal Reserve. We're going to get into all that, but if you don't discuss it from the focal point or the foundation of the Bible, my favorite version is the King James Bible, then you're just misguided. It's a non-starter, in my opinion. So, so I keep this in my car, the Bible for reading. This is it. It's worth more than all the books in the world combined, all of history combined, and it's just that simple. So with that, go to my website, boxofsunglasses.com, okay, and that's in honor of John Carpenter's great movie, They Live, and we'll get into that, the book on the next page. And also, the most important thing, if you get nothing else out of this video, on the top of my website, God's Simple Salvation Plan. It's about a 5 to 10 minute read. It could be the most important thing you've ever read. All the other stuff we're going to talk about notwithstanding. And I always try to start my interviews, whether I'm on the radio, podcast across the country, with that fact. So again, the website's boxofsunglasses.com. And let me just scroll down here and just bear with me to the next page. So here we have the dollar bill on top of the cover of my first book. This is available on my website, on Amazon. All my books are available. We'll get into the other ones in a second. But basically, what we have here is St. John's the Divine Cathedral on Manhattan's Upper West Side. My candidate for Mystery Babylon, by the way. We'll get into that later on. But anyway, juxtaposed or beneath an image of your so-called Federal Reserve note, notice the capitalist pyramids on top of both, so you're already starting to see the connections. And St. John's was bought to us by one J.P. Morgan, okay, one step below the Rockefeller name. And we'll get into that name when we get into the Un-American Genocidal Complex, if it has to do with the demise of the country, the United States, the Federal Reserve, the creation of Adolf Hitler, which we'll get into, the creation of communism, so-called, all the liberal so-called movements. That name is not far to be found, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But again, and if you look, what I did, just to go back, I embedded They Live inside the theory of evolution, okay? So for those imbeciles out there, those 200 IQ imbeciles, so-called scientific experts, we'll get into it, I think that evolution has anything to do with science. No, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We'll get into the real purpose of evolution and what it really means. So They Live, again, in honor of John Carpenter's great 1980s movie, They Live. Great Society of the Undead, I have great in quotes, okay? And that has a double meaning, okay? The Great Society, of course, being the sellout of the black community in the United States by the so-called white liberal Lyndon Baines Johnson, and we'll get into that, and of course the undead being the United Nations. But it has a double meaning, okay? and we'll get into that. Probably not in this session. I would like to keep this session to about an hour or so. I know people are busy. There's a lot of distractions and all this sort of thing. So I'll try to keep this to an hour and a half to get through all the information here. But be that as it may, as I mentioned, it's a double meaning to the Great Society. And it's demonic, and I'm going to say that literally. And I have the quotes to back it up, but we're going to get into all that. It's actually a preview of the upcoming Great Reset. Okay, and we'll get into the word great, what it really means. It's the name that our Illuminati overlords and Freemasons and all that whole crowd, it's a name for their king, their leader, the devil and his sidekick, the horned god mentioned in Revelation 13. And again, I'm not just making this stuff up. It's fully corroborated on my website and the many books that I've read and used in the course of all my research. So we're going to get into all that. And just while I'm on it, I mean, here's my second book, the Un-American Genocidal Complex. Okay, the Georgia Guidestones, which many conspiracy theorists have heard of. Skull and Bones, the American Illuminati. Okay, George Bush, you know, the war on terror, remember that whole scam? You know, Skull and Bones, Illuminati. Yeah, it's a historical body. It's not conspiracy theory. And of course, the United Nations, or the undead, as I just mentioned. And we'll be visiting this book, revisiting it in a few minutes. And then here's my last book, Pleased to Meet You. And basically, what I did is a fictional account, so-called, based on, you know, thematically, I took the idea from C.S. Lewis, famous Christian writer, Screwtape Letters, and I invented a conversation between the devil, who goes by the name of Kull, okay, which so happens to be an ascended master, that Alice Bailey, founder of the Lucis Trust, of Lucifer's publishing company at the United Nations. It's not conspiracy theory, and we'll get into that in the show. You know, she contacted an ascended master, okay, probably a demon, and she quotes him in quotes in his book. And anyway, that's the main character, and he talks to an O'Brien character, and they go through history, most of the United States history, and it's a fictional conversation, but the historical events that are discussed are real, and I just can find no other way than to conglomerate all the information that I have and put it into an easy to understand book. So anyway, those are my three books that are available on my website through Amazon, again, boxofsunglasses.com. So moving on here, just for information purposes, this is the outline of the table of contents of my first book. Again, They Live, Great Society of the Undead. Section 1, which is available on my website. What happened was it was too large at the time when I published it back in 2008 to publish in one book, and I just didn't have the financial resources to break it up. So I posted it as a PDF. Section 1 is posted on my website, and basically what it is, and it's available. You can download it. You're on the honor system. There's a PayPal link there to pay for it. If you can't pay for it, then I guess it is what it is. But anyway, it goes through a very logical, sequential, as everything on my website, it's logically and sequentially laid out and outlines. I should probably mention this, you know, my background is civil engineering, my education, my professional career is civil engineering. I'm a licensed professional engineer. So, you know, I'm not a theologist. I have no theology background, formal. Everything I'm discussing is self-learned and self-taught. And I'm not saying that just to say how smart I am. I don't consider myself particularly brilliant. I mean, there's a lot of engineers that are very brilliant, and I've come across in my life, and I'll just leave it at that. But it does substantiate the logical and categorical way in which I approach my research and try to disseminate information. So anyway, so section 1, the only way, it goes through Christian apologetics, and then I compare Christianity to the other so-called main religions, the religion of peace, Islam, religion of peace. I mean, just try picking up the Quran and see what a scam that is. Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, New Age, okay, they all tie together. Roman Catholicism, okay, Roman Catholicism, this is what people just, they use the terms interchangeably, Roman Catholicism and Christianity. Roman Catholicism is not Christianity, and I know this is not going to make me popular with my Roman Catholic friends, and I'm not saying all Roman Catholics are devil worshippers or evil, and I know the Roman Catholic Church has done some great missionary work over the years and era, but I just want to say from a purely biblical standpoint, it is not Christianity, okay? What the Roman Catholic Church basically did was that it mixed Roman, Egyptian, and Greek paganism in with legitimate Christianity, so that's why you have things like the Queen of Heaven, Mary, the Mother of God. That's not biblical. The only place you see Queen of Heaven mentioned in the Bible is Jeremiah chapter 7, and it's not good in terms of what the ancient Israel, God's chosen people, were worshiping, and it basically goes to the whore goddess Isis of ancient Egypt, Artemis, Diana, mentioned in the book of Acts. But anyway, so, again, excuse me if I go off on little tangents here, but I'm doing the best I can. But anyway, and it's a works-based religion. Christianity, I mean, you're forgiven. If you believe in Jesus, that's it. I mean, you're forgiven. And of course, you must go out and preach to the world. The Great Commission, Matthew 28, but there's no works involved, there's no confession, there's no purgatory, there's no rosary. I mean, I was brought up Roman Catholic in a very strict Roman Catholic church. I went to all the classes, communion, it's all nonsense, okay? Ephesians 2, okay? Salvation is a gift, it's a free gift from God, and that's it, okay? You don't need a formal church, you don't need a pope, okay? And all that sort of thing. In Matthew 23, call no one on earth master or father. Pope, father, come on. Anyway, so I compare all that, other Christian so-called religions, section 2, okay, we go through, now I get into the so-called conspiracy. Excuse me for a second, let me get this figured out. So section 2, the March to One World Communism, I talk about all the stuff that the conspiracy theorists talk about, the Federal Reserve, the United Nations, the whole thing, and all that. So that's all fully documented. And moving on, and then section 3, the emergent world religion, okay, the one world religion, which we're all being kind of driven into like a bunch of cattle. I mean, religion, politics, philosophy, science are kind of all fusing together into the one world kingdom of the so-called Antichrist. And that's all discussed here in section 3 of the book. Okay, but again, it's a very long book. So, and what I did here, this is the bibliography. Okay, and I'll just go through it. There's just in this book alone, okay, just so I'm not making this stuff up, from a variety of sources, everything from New Age to so-called ascended masters, from people like Alice Bailey that channeled these ascended masters, and an ascended master that goes by the name of Robert Christian or Saint Germain, okay, which is one and the same with the builder of the Georgia Guidestones, the mysterious builder of the Georgia Guidestones, okay, which we'll get into, which called for world population, world religion. So all these sources are here, okay, both conspiratorial and non-conspiratorial, New Age, it's all in there, okay? And I figure there's about 200 just on that alone, okay? And that doesn't count all the other bibliography and footnotes from my other work on my website. So, there's several hundred sources, so we'll just kind of page through those. Okay, so there they are, all 5 pages, and so. And here's the conspiracy. So here's what I want to break this down into, and I thought about it, and I talked to Marshall about it, and I was going to kind of jam everything into one session, but it was just too much. So the way I'm going to approach this overall from the conspiracy is from the secular so-called side of things and the biblical end times. Now, the biblical end times will be at a future date. So we're going to stick with the secular, but as you'll see, the secular is so vast. I mean, it basically boils down to life itself. I mean, John 1, 1 John chapter 5, the whole world lies under the guise of the wicked one. Ephesians 6, the spiritual warfare, that, we wrestle against the princes and the rulers of this dark world. So And in Luke chapter 4, Satan controls the world. He promises all the kingdoms of the world to Jesus in a moment of time, which means that he owns them, okay? And that's just objective biblical fact, okay? So we're living in a dark world, and we'll get into much of the symbolism in the future. And I can tell you, just as another, as a quick aside, most of these so-called biblical experts that regard national Israel, Zionist Israel, as the center or focal point of end times events, no, it's the United States. I know that might be new to a lot of people, but we'll get into that more into the biblical, a little bit at the end of this session, but much more in the biblical end times session that we'll do at a future date. But something to keep in mind as we move on here. So moving on. So here's the general outline, okay, the secular, okay, we're going to get into the 4 horsemen of the American apocalypse, what I call the 4 horsemen of the American apocalypse, that being the, quote, federal, quote, reserve system. It's not federal, there's no reserves, it's a textbook Ponzi scheme, it's a scam. So yes, our whole economy is a lie, and it's got to come to its logical and mathematical conclusion, and that is total bankruptcy of these very United States, the late great United States, okay? And it's just that simple. The Un-American Genocidal Complex, and we'll go through my book and kind of focus on the Rockefeller family and what they've been doing, the creation of the AIDS virus, back in the 80s, eugenics, abortion, we'll get into all that. That's the Un-American Genocidal Complex, the Great Society. Okay, I mentioned it briefly before. We'll delve into that a little bit more and what it really means, okay, from a secular standpoint. Significant dates, okay, which I very rarely heard people put dates together, but there are some significant dates we'll talk about. And then mass genocide, okay, that has been the purveyors of this mass genocide has been the so-called conspirators, the American Illuminati, the Skull and Bones, the CFR, Bilderberg crowd, okay, and we'll get into all that, but again, we're talking about tens of millions of people here. Darwinism as an engine of mass genocide, communism, Nazis, it all comes from the science of Darwinism, and we'll get into that. As I mentioned, a scientific scam of biblical proportions. So moving on, let's scroll down here. So the 4 horsemen of the American apocalypse. And then down here, okay, so what are they? Let me just go through. I mentioned the Federal Reserve. The second one's evolution. Third one, global warming, global cooling, climate change. Okay, and the fourth one, separation of church and state. Okay, and we'll get into all that, and basically at the bottom, if you can read it, it says they live, everything is a lie. And that's posted on my website. There's a link. Again, I embed the name they live into everything is a lie. So as we're going to see shortly, Federal Reserve, evolution, global warming, global cooling, climate change, separation of church and state, they're all blatant lies. Okay, it's just, I don't know what else to say. I mean, this is what the experts are telling us. So again, you're already starting to see how hard it is to separate the so-called secular from the biblical. You're already starting to see that, just like in John Carpenter's They Live, everything the so-called establishment puts out is a lie. And why is it? Because the ruler of this dark world, Satan, the prince of this world, John chapter 12, is running the show. Okay? Again, the Bible is the core of the quote conspiracy. It's just that simple. And anyway, let's move on. So the Un-American Genocidal Complex, okay, my second book, it goes into the Adolf Hitler, okay. He's made in the United States financially with things like a company like IG Farben, okay, which was basically a Standard Oil, a Rockefeller Standard Oil spin-off, okay, with the industrial backbone of Adolf Hitler, okay. He was financed by the same gangbankers, as I like to call them, gangbangers. These are the gangbankers, okay. He was financed. This is a historical fact. Again, it's documented. Again, like everything on my website, there's footnotes, bibliographies, everything's here. People are free to research me and question me and all that sort of thing. But anyway, so one of the most evil people in world history financially and philosophically. We're going to get into that a little bit too here in a minute when we get into the science of evolution. Okay, so philosophically, not just industrially and financially was Adolf Hitler created the United States. Philosophically, he got all his ideas from the Darwinists and the social Darwinists and the theory of evolution and survival of the fittest and all that other nonsense, which we're going to read about here in a few minutes. So Adolf Hitler created in the United States, not just him, okay, Chairman Mao, China, okay, Joseph Stalin, communism. It's documented in a book called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton, okay, were also created in the United States. And you might say, well, why would the richest industrialists in the world create something called communism that's supposedly to fight capitalism? But this is where the term, I think it was Khrushchev or Lenin, maybe Lenin came up with the term useful idiot, talking about American liberals. Communism ain't about equality, okay? It's a godless system of statist megalomaniacs who want control, okay? It's centralized control. It has nothing to do with spreading the wealth or the common man or whatever BS Karl Marx was spewing, okay? This is why the richest industrialists in the world stand behind people like Adolf Hitler and Mao and Stalin, is because it's about population control, physical, genocide, we're talking hundreds of millions of people here, and financial control, just total control. And again, we're marching towards one world communism with the so-called Great Reset coming up here in 2030, and it's all being facilitated by things like climate change. And anyway, so I get into all that in this book, okay? You know, the climate change, the eugenics, you know, a brief overview of the eugenics, the American Eugenic Society, which again was spawned by Charles Darwin, which we're going to get to more here in a minute, and all this sort of thing. The creation of the AIDS virus, okay, was made right here at Camp Cancer, okay, Cold Spring Harbor in Fort Detrick, Maryland, okay, and that's all corroborated. And just another fun fact, when I was a young student at Vanderbilt University and doing a research in my microbiology class, I did it on AIDS, and I came up with all information, and it was just startling what I came up with. A videotape called the Strecker Memorandum, and I checked out, you know, Dr. Strecker's work, and he was exactly correct that the AIDS virus was not created by some green monkey biting some African on the butt, and all of a sudden you had AIDS all over Africa and homosexual population here in the United States. It was an artificially created disease. I know this is, you know, going on 40, 50-year-old information, but the concept is the precedent is there for things like COVID and other things that the establishment pulled off more recently. And then I have in the back, I have the government documents, okay, that back this up. There's all kinds of human experimentation and overview on Cold War era programs put out by the Government Accounting Office, okay, talking about how the military subjects American citizens to different tests without their knowledge, and they don't know the effects of these tests. I mean, there's government documents. I mean, they're in the book. I'm not just making this up. This isn't conspiracy theory, okay? There's other stuff back here. So that's all documented in the Un-American Genocidal Complex. So again, Adolf Hitler, the Rockefeller Empire, and population control, okay? It's all coming from the United States. Again, I'll say it again, I'm gonna get back to this, Mystery Babylon. There's no other candidate in my mind based on the evil that has disseminated from these very United States. And I say that with the utmost regret. I'm not anti-American, okay? I'm anti these evil devils, literally, that have taken it over from its inception. Excuse me, so I just gotta get this back up. But anyway, so we're moving on here. So we'll go on to there's the front cover of the American Genocidal Complex, which we just discussed, okay? The Nazi swastika, the skull and bones, United Nations, okay? And then here, you can't really see this, but this is in the Un-American Genocidal Complex. This is the Rockefeller Empire, okay? You can see, and obviously you're not gonna be able to read it, but if you go in there, what I did was I took the Rockefeller Complex just as an example. Again, these were the co-founders of the Federal Reserve System, which we're gonna get into here, and what they control in terms of media, and all the movements. If it has something to do with the downfall of America, the Rockefeller name's not far to be found, okay? That I can guarantee you. Just as an aside, Alex Jones of InfoWars puts out great information, put out a great video years ago about Bohemian Grove, okay, where David Rockefeller invites some of the most powerful politicians in the United States and the world out to Looney, California, near San Francisco, Bohemian Grove, where they worship a 40-foot tall owl called Moloch. Okay, this is Baal out of Canaan, of the Old Testament, okay? So, again, you can see how hard it is to separate this stuff from the, quote, secular to the biblical, but anyway, so there's that chart. That's in the back of the Un-American Genocidal Complex, so that's there for your reading entertainment. And then moving on here, and here's another chart, okay, that talks about the control of our society. This is in the back of the Un-American Genocidal Complex, okay, and it discusses, this is taken from Anthony Sutton's book, he was a writer, wrote many great books on the co-conspiracy, but he talks about all the different groups, and what I did was I added Robert Christian, builder of the Georgia Guidestones, which some of you may have heard about, which are documented in the Un-American Genocidal Complex, that's called for things like world government and a world population of 500 million people, which would be a 90% reduction in the current world population, which, as I mentioned and I've documented, that our criminal devil overlords have been doing for the past almost 200 years, starting with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So anyway, that's the Un-American Genocidal Complex, and people can support me, and I'll just say this, I don't beg for money. I have donations for the PDFs that I post on my site for all my books, okay? You can buy my books, and that's how you can support me to get this message out. But anyway, so as I mentioned, we talked a little bit before about I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, about the 4 horsemen of the American apocalypse. So let's just go back there. Okay, we got into a lot of it with the Un-American Genocidal Complex. But anyway, let's talk Federal Reserve. Okay, number 1 of my horsemen. Okay, as I mentioned, it's not federal. There are no reserves. Okay, it's how do I put this? It's a scam. Okay, it's a Ponzi scheme. Okay, it was set up by Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Rothschild money interest from Europe. Okay, and so basically, I don't know what they teach in history anymore. In high school, we had this stuff. When I was in high school 40 years ago, this was the Hamiltonian Federalists against the Jeffersonian Anti-Federalists. Okay, the origin of political parties and that sort of thing. But basically, Hamilton, which I'm disappointed to say, kind of sold out to the Rothschild money interest and insisted on a central bank, and he got George Washington, who I believe made a mistake. I believe George Washington was a Christian and a great patriot and not part of the conspiracy. Okay, and we'll get into that with the separation of church and state. But anyway, Hamilton convinced George Washington, and he signed into law the first central bank, which is a Rothschild bank. So basically, that means we had to borrow money from the Rothschilds to finance the United States instead of printing the money itself, as is authorized or specified in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, okay, where Congress shall basically create money and determine its value. Okay, that's right out of the Constitution, and that's what Jefferson was saying. So fast forward, the first charter I think was 1792, 1812, 20-year charter. It came up for vote. It did not pass. The second bank, and a lot of sources that I have read have come across saying that the War of 1812 was actually a Rothschild war where they convinced the King of England to attack the United States for as retaliation for not reinstitutionalizing or redoing the charter of the central bank. Okay, so for 4 years we did not have a central bank. Okay, long story short, 1816 we did have another central bank because there was so much debt from the aforementioned War of 1812. Andrew Jackson, okay, came in. He was a war hero, not the greatest guy in the world in some aspects, his treatment of the Indians, I get that, okay, but he did fight the Federal Reserve System. He said Jackson and no bank was his campaign slogan, and basically he got rid of the Federal Reserve System and was the only president in history to fully pay off the Federal Reserve gangsters, a den of vipers and thieves, he called them. Okay, that's right out of John chapter 2, where Jesus physically chases the money changers out of the temple with whips, okay, a den of vipers. Okay, so fast forward, I mean, for almost 100 years, we did not have a central bank in this country. Okay, the Rockefeller Empire came online during that time, which with the oil, discovered oil. Okay, they got financing, initial financing, something from the Rothschild money interest in Europe. Okay, and the Rothschilds were busy in Europe, taking over the central banks and the economies there. Okay, so Rothschild, J.P. Morgan was another one, okay, who became very powerful during this time with the railroads and the steel industry and this sort of thing. So basically what happened is these guys all got together and decided they needed to take over the United States. So what they did was they fermented and perpetuated a silent coup on the United States called the Third Central Bank, or today's, quote, federal, quote, reserve system. Okay, and that's it. I mean, that's the core, that's the basic history. It was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson, okay, the progressive sellout who got us into World War I, which was very profitable for aforementioned bankers, Rockefeller, Morgan, Rothschild. Okay, so World War I was, again, not an accident. But it was signed into law because all the bankers got Teddy Roosevelt to run for president and split the Republican vote, because there were still a lot of people that would not have supported a central bank, an illegal Federal Reserve System, but they were able to split the vote, bring in Woodrow Wilson. He signed it into law right before the Christmas break in 1913, and then we have today's beast system, okay, figuratively and literally. And basically what it does at its core is it creates money literally out of nothing, okay, and loans it to the government at interest. Okay, the scam is that bad. Okay, so when you peel away all the onion layers of the 200 IQ Harvard and University of Chicago economists, they're all full of crap. Okay, because at the end of the day, the fuel that runs this engine called our economy is crap. It's air. It's nothing. Okay, Proverbs 22:7. Okay, the debtor is slave to the lender. Okay, and I go through that in my discussion on the Federal Reserve in my first book. I will take that over all the experts in all these colleges and on these shows, Fox Business and Circus NBC and all the crap, all right? Because it can financially never be, it's just mathematically impossible to pay off. So if I'm the Federal Reserve and I loan my friend Marshall here money, and Marshall goes and spends it on illegal wars, Social Security, whatever the government spends its money on, how's Marshall, and I'm charging him interest on it, so I give him $10, and I charge him 10% interest, let's say. Marshall owes me $11, how's Marshall gonna pay me back? The short answer is, and the right answer is, he can't. The only way he can pay me back is to keep the scam going, so he's gotta borrow more money from me the next year. Now he owes me $20 and $2 interest. So that's why I say it's mathematically impossible to pay off. Now, of course, what happens today, I mean, I hear other people say, well, we owe the money to just to explain, as far as the bonds, a lot of people have invested, there's foreign investors in the system, there's pension funds, they're just loaning these fake Federal Reserve notes that were ultimately created by the Federal Reserve System out of nothing and loaning it back to the government's paying them interest on it, okay? But the core of all money was ultimately created at the Federal Reserve System. No matter what the breakdown is, the percentage of what the government owes money to, it doesn't matter, okay? And I don't know what the exact breakdown is. I think it's like, say 70% of the money, today's debt, just to discuss this so people understand. And maybe it's, let's just say 70 to 80% is owed to foreign governments and pension funds and the public in general that loan the money. Still 20% of that money is owed to the Federal Reserve System. But let's just say, just as an illustration, let's just say the government magically came up with all the money to pay off all those private investors, which it can't. You would still owe money to the Federal Reserve System, which is perpetually charging interest, okay? So, it's impossible ever to pay off. So, we're all debt slaves. I mean, you think you're rich in this country? No, you're not. You're not, because, like I said, the government pays off all the debt and you think you have all this money. We got to pay back the Federal Reserve System with interest. And lo and behold, what was created to enforce that payback was something called the IRS and the federal income tax, which was also created by the same gangbankers around the same time as the Federal Reserve System to collect the interest owed to them. So if you think you own your money, sorry, Jack, it's all owed to the Federal Reserve System, okay? And this is why I say it's mathematically and logically impossible ever to pay off. And it's also a textbook Ponzi scheme, okay? So what the government does, I mean, it's taking money and it's floating bonds. But what's it doing is it cashes out the bonds when they come due in 2 years, 10 years, 30 years, whatever. And it pays those bondholders back. It's paying them interest. But it needs new money, fresh money to pay back those old people. So it's a Ponzi scheme, but with a twist, because when there's not enough buyers of the debt, foreign governments and this sort of thing, the government steps in with what's called QE. It's a fancy name for money printing and a word to hyperinflation, which is what's going on in the world today, October 2025, all right? The Federal Reserve is printing the money to buy the bonds the government's floating because there's no demand from foreign governments or private investors anymore, okay? So they're hyperinflating the economy. It's covering. So in other words, it's a Ponzi scheme with a twist of, if the Ponzi scheme doesn't have money to keep itself going, in a Ponzi scheme out here in society, it collapses, people go to jail, but the government, the Ponzi scheme, if it starts to collapse as it is now doing, the government just prints the money, pays itself. So it's a joke. Our economy is a joke, okay? So all the idiots, the Fox people say Trump's doing a great job on the economy. Trump's full of crap too, all right? If he was really serious, he would have come on day one and declared a national debt emergency. Okay, we have to pay this down. We have to go back to a hard money system, tie the dollar to gold, okay, and issue debt-free United States Treasury notes, okay, as somebody by the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy tried to do in 1961. Okay, he started issuing debt-free notes or silver coins from the Treasury through executive order, in addition to trying to get us out of the Vietnam War and trying to take on the CIA. And he was blown away in broad daylight by, the magic bullet and all this other sort of things. So they killed him. So the Rockefeller interest, I don't know who the physical people is, some say the mafia, the CIA, whoever, but they killed him in broad daylight as a message to future presidents not to mess with the Rockefeller Federal Reserve. You have Rockefeller lackeys sitting on the so-called Warren Commission. Okay, just a scam. The whole thing is a scam. Okay, the magic bullet, Lee Harvey Oswald. So it gave way to Lyndon Baines Johnson, the white liberal who gave us the Great Society, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. So that's kind of an overview of the Federal Reserve System, and it is going to implode the United States economy soon. Okay, and these psychopaths in Washington and Trump getting us into all these wars, okay, with Russia, Israel, these so-called God's chosen people, and all this Venezuela, talking big. Folks, we're economically dead in the water, okay? We're eating ourselves financially, again, QE, thanks to the Federal Reserve System. So again, we got off the godly foundation of our founders who insisted on a sound money system and gone the way of the Rothschild Rockefeller Federal Reserve scam. But one thing I should say is that what it has done is it allowed the financing of all these evil wars, Adolf Hitler, communism, the war, so-called war on terror, all these illegal wars, all this welfare that these low-level scum politicians in Washington, they buy off all these welfare recipients. None of it would be possible without the Federal Reserve System. It's a honey trap, in other words. They've gotten people addicted to free health care, free welfare, food stamps, Social Security, all this other crap. Social Security is another scam. They've taken that money and spent it on other things. So I just mentioned this aside, the actual deficit in this nation's north of 100 trillion, not the 37 trillion they keep talking about because of unfunded loan. Because they stole the money from Social Security and used for other things to cover over the real deficit. So the money that the government actually owns is hundreds of trillions. But anyway, getting back, the Federal Reserve System has allowed all of this, okay, to make us dependent on it. Okay, so we're all little piglets and sucklings and calves to the teat of the gangbankers at the Federal Reserve System is the way to put it. So that's it in a nutshell. You can read more about it in my book, but if I miss some things, I apologize. But again, I don't know what else to say on that. So the next scam, okay, is evolution. Okay, it's a scientific scam. Okay, and people can go on my website. If you're so interested, again, boxofsunglasses.com. I did have an evolution debate years ago with physicists, attorneys, historians, all kinds of experts in the field. Okay, and basically what I did to that, and I'll give you the upshot. I mean, it's like 4 to 6 hours, something like that. You don't have to listen to it. I'll give you the upshot. Is basically I asked them a simple question out of physics, high school physics. How does the Big Bang comport with Newton's laws of motion? Okay, and it was a loaded question, I admit. Because Isaac Newton himself, one of the greatest scientists, most brilliant people in world history, became a Christian and studied the Bible more than he did developing calculus and physics, because he knew his laws worked, but he couldn't explain their origin, okay, like how they work. They say they had to come from outside the physical world. So anyway, so I asked them, just to make a point, and I got a lot of crap, okay, I got some insults, I got this and that, but I said, just give me a book, just a scientific study on how it is, something explodes, forget the whole gravity, the pull of the amount of mass that would hold that together, how that energy was, I'll get into that in a second, just how it happened. How did the planets circle around the sun? You had an explosion, and Newton's laws say things should just continue in motion until they're acted upon, Newton's first, second, and third law. I got no answer, of course. So in other words, it's not science, okay? It's a philosophy, it's a religion, it's the religion of atheism. Okay, it's a load of crap. Okay, if you look at the known laws of science, the first and second law of thermodynamics. Okay, energy cannot be created or destroyed; it just changes form. Second law, the law of entropy. Everything decays in the universe, including the universe itself decays, which indicates that the universe did in fact have a beginning. Okay, so when you think about that, that's where the Big Bang came from. Basically, said, well, we can't say the universe existed forever, because if it existed forever, then the second law of thermodynamics. Now, you notice I said law of thermodynamics, the world should have decayed into nothingness by now. So they came up with this idiocy called the Big Bang, and I just talked about that. So look, it's nonsense. And then you got the law of biogenesis, okay, jelly, water, plastic, inorganic chemicals, whatever these idiots want to say, spontaneously came into life. Nothing comes to life. It's so stupid, for lack of a better word. Okay, and these are the experts. So again, it's I don't care how smart these people think they are, and some of them probably do have 200 IQs, but they're fools. Romans chapter 1, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Okay, or 1 Corinthians, okay, chapter 1 and chapter 2, the wisdom of this world, the best wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. Okay, these people are fools, all right, to believe this stuff. Okay, so scientifically, it's a much bigger scam than the global warming, global cooling, climate change, which we're going to get to next. Okay, it's much bigger because, as I mentioned before, and when talking about the Un-American Genocidal Complex, it gave us something called the social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest. Okay, the American Eugenics Society. Okay, so in other words, evolution. Only the unfit. They decay and they die, and only the fit survive. That's what evolution produced. It produced communism. Produced. Now you're starting to see the philosophy of Adolf Hitler. Now see where Adolf Hitler got all those ideas from. You're starting to see that because Charles Darwin was a scam artist. And let me just do this. Okay, I have a book here. Just getting back real quickly, the science article, it's called In the Beginning by a gentleman by the name of Walter Brown. Okay, he has a doctorate in mechanical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay, this is a smart guy. Okay, that's like the NFL or the professional of intellectuals, MIT, and this guy's got a doctorate. Okay, so you can go through this book, and I have no affiliation or ties to Dr. Brown, but creationscience.com, and if you're so interested, you can get this book. Now, this is a science book, okay, and it goes into the young Earth, and there's graphs in here, and some of the stuff is really hard to read. You really do need an engineering degree to understand it. There's numbers in here, there's graphs, arguments for a young Earth, the pressure of the oil beneath the Earth, the helium, ratio of the helium in the atmosphere, the sediments in the ocean. Okay, it's all in here. Okay, science, graphs, math, numbers. in the beginning, okay? So there are scientists out there that are creationists, and they back it up, they document it. Now to contrast that, when I was talking about with evolution, okay, here's Charles Darwin, the scam artist of scam artists, okay? Talking about the descent of man, okay? This is Charles Darwin, okay? You know, the scientist who brought us evolution. And I just want to read from here, just to be sure, okay? Some of the imbeciles from places like Harvard, okay? You know, DEI Central, you know, racism, right? You know, we're all raised, white people are racist, you know, like Harvard. So here's what this guy has to say. This is the descent of man. This is from the introduction, okay? This is a, what was this guy's name here? Introduction. Now I'm going to read some quotes. James Burks, PhD, a doctor from Harvard, okay? This is what he says about evolution. Charles Darwin, who viewed life on Earth in terms of an evolutionary framework grounded in science and reason. I just got done saying evolution's a bunch of crap, okay? It contradicts every known law, established law of science, okay? We just went through that. So already this guy's a liar, all right? And in fact, evolutionism still remains an anathema to many in this century, especially among the religious creationists and biblical fundamentalists, all right? The descent of man, Charles Darwin, okay? Darwin's dangerous fact of human evolution. Let's just talk about that fact of human evolution. Let's talk about Piltdown Man, okay? They took the teeth of an orangutan and combined it with a human skull back in 1912, I think it was. For 40 years, this was passed off in the American Rockefeller-controlled media as proof of evolution. It turned out to be a scam. All right, this is their evidence. But you don't. James Burks from Harvard doesn't mention that. That slipped his mind, I guess. But anyway, so we have Darwin's dangerous fact of human evolution has changed forever how we view. Excuse me, my thing went away again. How we view our own species with a natural history no longer is Aristotelian fixity or Thomistic theism or dualism admissible to a sound interpretation of the human being. The myth of creation as espoused by religious creationists and biblical fundamentalists, okay, Mr. Harvard, has been replaced by the fact of evolution. The fact of evolution, okay? All right, so this is Harvard, okay? Remember, diversity central, right? We're against racism, Harvard, James Burks. And while the religious objections to evolution will be lost in the flow of history, the scientific value of Darwin's works will last for all human time. This guy's a douchebag, and I'm being generous, from Harvard. All right, well, let's go on to read look, this is the descent of man, okay? It's crap. There's nothing in here. It's a bunch of verbiage and nonsense. There's nothing scientific about it. Things like Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man, and they took a tooth from a pig and extrapolated the whole human being. The American Museum of Natural History, puts this stuff on display. It's all a bunch of crap, okay? Natural selection is affecting civilized nations, okay? With savages, this is Charles Darwin, the scientist of evolution fact, according to Harvard. All right, with savages, the weak in body and mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, it's code word for white people, okay? Charles Darwin and his friends, the Rockefeller and Rothschilds, okay? Institutional racism, right? Systemic racism. Here it is, douchebag. James Burks from Harvard. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile. Okay, this is science, according to James Burks from Harvard. All right, we build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized society propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt this is the most highly injurious to the race of man, okay? And this language is going to sound very familiar, okay? We're going to get to Margaret Sanger in a minute, so keep this language in mind. There is, however, no doubt that the various races, when carefully compared and measured, differed much from each other, as in the texture of hair, the relative proportion of all parts of the body, the capacity of the lungs, the form and capacity of the skull, and even the convolution of the brains. The races also differ in constitution, acclimatization, and liability to certain diseases. The mental characteristics are likewise very distinct. Okay, then he goes on to say, everyone who has the opportunity of comparison must have been struck with the contrast between the taciturn, even morose aborigines of South America and the lighthearted, talkative Negroes. James Burks from Harvard, this is your science. All right, there is a nearly similar contrast between the Malays and the Papuans, who live under the same physical condition and are separated from each other by a narrow space of sea. Okay, so this is Charles Darwin and Descent of Man. Okay, science, according to Dr. James Burks from Harvard. Okay, DEI Central. They sell us a bunch of crap about systemic racism. And white Christians are the Nazis and the racists, right? Douchebag. This is where Hitler got his ideas from. Dr. James Burks. Schmuck. All right. So that is the descent of man. Now let's go back to the Un-American Genocidal Complex. If some of that language that I just read sounds familiar. Here's Margaret Sanger, okay? You have to say Margaret Sanger. Hillary Clinton, you know, the progressive, just like Woodrow Wilson, who I mentioned before, collected the Margaret Sanger Award. Here's some of what she had to say, okay? The American Birth Control League, which she founded, which has been termed the Negro Project, which you know today as Planned Parenthood, okay? Recently, eugenics has cropped up again and again in the form of selective breeding, and biologists and geneticists, President Davenport, she mentions all the names, Cold Spring Harbor, okay, which again was the genesis of many of biological research. I call Camp Cancer in the book, okay. I accepted one branch of this philosophy of eugenics, okay. Morons, imbeciles, what we just read in Charles Darwin, the scientist. Without birth control, it seemed to me a house built upon sands. It could not stand against the winds, against the furious winds of economic pressure which had buffeted into partial or total helplessness a tremendous portion of the human race. So we have that, okay. This is more from Margaret Sanger. There is but one practicable and feasible program in handling the great problem of the feeble-minded. Does this sound like Charles Darwin and Adolf Hitler? Does this sound like science? Okay. That is, as the best authorities are agreed to prevent the birth of those who would transmit imbecility to their descendants. Feeble-mindedness and investigation and statistics from every country indicate as invariably associated with an alarmingly high rate of fertility. We are continually reminded modern conditions of civilization, as we are continually reminded, furnish the most favorable breeding ground for the mental defective, the moron, the imbecile. Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. It only gets better. Okay, I'm just going to take a quick quote. The minister's work is also important, and also he should be trained. She's talking about black ministers. Okay, Reverend Al Sharpton, right? Liberal, Reverend Al Sharpton, right? So the minister's work is also important, and he should be trained, perhaps by the Federation, as to our ideals and the goal we hope to reach. We do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Uppity Negroes? What's she talking about? What are you talking about, Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, Hillary Clinton, Margaret Sanger Award? What are we talking about here? Adolf Hitler. Okay, and just as, you know, another fun thing, on my website, you can go to the Evolution Quotes Quiz. Okay, it's on the website, and you can what I did is I quoted people like Margaret Sanger and Charles Darwin and no others in the American Eugenics Society, and I put them next to quotes from Adolf Hitler. And if you read what these people said and you compare it to Adolf Hitler, it's indistinguishable. Okay, you can't distinguish it. You go to the bottom and the answers are there. But these are the people that want to call white Christian, now especially men, like yours truly, the racist. But they're purveying Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. So I don't know what else to say. And you can go to a website called blackgenocide.org where a lot of this is documented as well. And not only that, you can see what abortion really is. You can see the pictures, okay, of what abortion does to the unborn. Okay, and now we're in this country, we're at 70 million plus, okay, in a large proportion. I think it's like 40% of the abortions are done in the black community. The abortion clinics are planted in the black community, okay. Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. You're starting to see a pattern here. Okay, so this is all emanating from the Rockefeller clan and their associates, okay, who brought us Charles Darwin. And don't forget, Darwinism as science was the fulcrum which we used to get to the separation of church and state. So we're going to segue into that at the end. But again, let's go back to so that's evolution, okay? So we're talking about science, supposed to be science, but we ended up in Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. Okay, so again. So let's go, before we get to separation of church and state, let's go to global warming, global cooling, climate change, because evolution segued into the idea, where has eugenics, besides Planned Parenthood, where has eugenics manifested itself today? And it's something called global warming, global cooling, climate change. And just like the name, itself, if it's such sound science, why do they have to change the name? It's as bad as the Federal Reserve. It's not federal, there's no reserves, it's a private institution. It's a lie. Just on its face, it's a lie. Okay? So, and just to substantiate this, and I'm trying to wrap this up here in the next 20 minutes, but on my website, there's something called the Inconvenient Scientific Method. Okay, there's a link, and what I did, and believe it or not, okay, I'll say this, as science, I believe that it does meet the criteria of the scientific methods. In other words, mankind is producing carbon dioxide and other pollutants, putting them in the atmosphere. Is it going to affect the environment? So I think that's a valid hypothesis, that meets the criteria of the scientific method. Which evolution does not, and I'll say it again, when you look at the established laws of science, evolution's a joke. Okay, but anyway, but when you look into it, as I did, I gone through the Inconvenient Scientific Method, it doesn't stack up. I mean, the quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the activity of the sun, it just breaks down. It's a non-issue, okay? So I go into all that. But again, we're hearing about carbon pollution, and again, who's behind all this? The Rockefeller Foundation. Who founded the United Nations? That pushing this crap, the Rockefellers. Okay, so, again, it's the same people that brought us the Federal Reserve System, okay? So you're starting to see a pattern here. So, again, not to go into all the scientific details, again, it's like a 20 or 30 page length, the Inconvenient Scientific Method. And I'll just give a couple of examples. I mean, Al Gore talks about, sea levels rising 20 feet or something. Al Gore's a moron, okay? Scientific, like Al Gore, if the polar ice caps, if they melted, now a significant portion of them float, they're icebergs, they float, so if they melted, it's called buoyancy, the ocean levels will actually sink. Now, does Al Gore account for this and all his, his calculations that you can't find anywhere about the ocean levels rising, 20 feet or whatever number, stupid number you pulled out? No. So it's that bad. It doesn't, it's like Pop Warner science. It's like, this is like 8th or 9th grade biology, basic biology, okay? And the computer models, okay? The computer models, and I've used computer models in my career, and I can tell you, yeah, they're a tool, but you got to take them with a grain of salt. And I can tell you, I have some experience in air pollution in my schooling. the Earth's atmosphere is a very complex entity. Okay, so for these morons, these imbeciles, these scientific whores at the UNDEADs, the IPCC, okay, another Rockefeller Foundation funded scam, to say that they can predict the Earth's atmosphere to a 10th of a degree, like 50 to 100 years out, is so stupid, technically stupid. I don't know where to begin, but they get all the media coverage in the Rockefeller, Soros, Rothschild-owned media. They say this is a fact and it's a calamity and it's all this other sort of thing. I mean, think about it. If the weatherman came on and said, well, it's going to be 45.2 degrees in Central Park on Saturday, what are you, a moron? Nobody says that. Okay, so if the local weatherman can't be that accurate within, let's say, a week to 2 weeks, how the hell do these guys say it's a joke? Okay, is my point. Okay, but it's a thin facade of science to cover over the American eugenics movement. It's about population control, okay? And that's what I cover in the Un-American Genocidal Complex. There's that linkage. That's the carry forward to today, okay? That's what it's really all about, okay? And the environmental movement, okay, and I've always said this, and I've said this across the nation on millions of radio stations, if you want to help the environment, the best people to get rid of would be the radical environmental movement. I mean, these are non-scientific crackpots. These are Gaia, earth-worshipping, nature weirdos, okay, with a thin veneer of science led by the scam artist Al Gore, okay, and the United Nations, okay. This is about earth worship at its core, okay. Gaia, the Gaia hypothesis, which I discussed in the Un-American Genocidal Complex, the earth is a living organism, okay? They're worshiping the created over the creator, Romans chapter 1. So again, you can see how quickly it's hard to confine this secular discussion on a secular basis, okay? But it's really bad science, okay? But as I was saying before, like, for example, they want to block the sun. Bill Gates, another psychopath, another nerd psychopath. Who the hell elected Bill Gates to anything with his vaccines? I just discussed how this deadly vaccines are with COVID and AIDS, okay? Not to mention the other vaccines. Who elected this nerd psychopath to anything? But now he's leading this charge to spray sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to block the sun, okay? Who's in charge of these? Who's controlling these people? You think about how stupid that is. Okay, so you're going to recreate a problem called acid rain, pollute the atmosphere to block the sun to solve an issue that doesn't exist. Okay, at the same time they're blocking the sun, we have this carbon capture technology all over the country. Okay, they're building pipelines in Iowa to capture carbon dioxide. So think about it. They're fundamentally changing the Earth's environment to solve a non-issue. Okay. They're short-circuiting the process called photosynthesis, okay? Again, this is stuff we learned in like 8th or 9th grade biology, okay? So photosynthesis is the source of life. You know, animals, humans breathe out CO2, plants take it in, they grow, they breathe out oxygen. You know, again, how did that evolve? Dr. Birx from Harvard, the process of photosynthesis. But anyway, so, you know, they're short-circuiting the process. They're gonna kill us all, in other words. These are psychopaths. This is the environment. This is the environmental movement. Okay, they gave us electric cars, electric batteries. Okay, they're creating solid waste disposal issues, mercury light bulbs. Remember that whole scam? So you're going to create a hazardous waste situation of mercury light bulbs to solve a problem that doesn't exist, and on and on and on. Okay. So it's not about the environment. These people are trashing the environment, and they're going to kill millions of people. If they achieve, Bill Gates and his marauders, his merrymakers, mass murdering, genocidal psychopaths achieve what they want, we won't have photosynthesis on this. That's the end of life on Earth. This is what we're talking about here. These people are, they're shot, they're gone. But these are the experts. Okay, so again, you can see how evil this is. And I'll say it again, born out of what I'm calling the Un-American Genocidal Complex. Much more evil, much more sinister than, the military-industrial complex. No, the Un-American Genocidal Complex is a much better name and a million times more evil than anything President Eisenhower talked about. Not that I'm saying that's good, but you're starting to see the orders of magnitude of evil that we're talking about here, okay? So that's and this, what's this driving us towards? The one world government, Agenda 21, okay, hand in hand with the Earth Summit, Okay, and where do a lot, and by the way, just as an aside, where do a lot of these religious environmentalists, wackos hang out, like Al Gore and other associations that I document in the Great Society of the Undead? St. John's the Divine Cathedral in Mystery Babylon, New York City, USA. Okay, so it's a religion. The Gaia hypothesis is a religion with a very thin veneer of scientific horrors that the IPCC, the Intergalactic Panel of Cosmic Clowns, running as cover. It's about population control, it's about death, it's about mass death, and they're achieving it, okay, as I document the UN-American Genocide, and my first book, diverting valuable farmland to grow corn-based ethanol, people are starving because of this. So Charles Darwin's eugenics, American Eugenics Society, Hitlerian, Mao, Joseph Stalin, population control, cranks, moves ever forward, okay? So that's that, okay? So what we're going to talk about lastly, the last of the four horsemen of the American Genocidal Complex, or the four horsemen of the American Apocalypse, okay, is something called separation of church and state, okay? So just to review, Federal Reserve, which finances all this crap, okay? Evolution, global warming, global climate change, and finally separation of church and state. Okay, and I just want to address some of my fellow conspiracy theorists who say, this nation was founded by Freemasons, they were, the founding fathers were deists. It's all a bunch of crap, okay? It's not true, all right? And I'm not saying they were perfect, and I know there's questions on Thomas Paine, was a Christian and kind of went to the dark side and supported the French Revolution, and he was denounced by the other founders, okay? But they came from a Christian society, okay, going all the way back to the Mayflower Compact, all the way up to the Revolution. They were brought up in Christian schools. And again, they weren't perfect, and all you had things like slavery, okay, which they argued about, and they just kind of punted on it, okay? I'm not saying these were perfect. 1838, slavery was outlawed in the United States, so it did correct itself, okay? The way historically we treated some of the Indians, and all that's evil. So it's not a perfect nation. No, the founders are not perfect, they were human. Okay, so we all need God's grace and salvation, right? But they were all Christians, different denominations, Anglicans, Lutherans, Quakers, Roman Catholics, some of them. Okay, but they all agreed that Christianity was the religion that needed to run this nation, okay? And again, I know a lot of the founders were Freemasons and this sort of thing, but Freemasonry, and I don't know if I got time to get into that today, but it's a core within a core, okay? The Illuminati came in, they overtook Freemasonry after Adam Weishaupt, back in the late, 1776. But if you talk to like your regular Freemason, you go like the Freemason lodges I've done, the Washington Mason Lodge in Washington, D.C., a lot of them don't have a clue, okay, about what Freemasonry, what they really worship. It's a club, it's a social club, okay, on one level. And look, they have done, I know the Shriners, they have done some good stuff, just like with the Roman Catholics, okay, again, I'm probably, whatever. I'm not bashing all, but I'm just saying, at its core, very simply, it's devil worship, okay? I'm just gonna get right to the point. And if you want, on my website, the Other Son of God link, which kind of ties all my work together, there's a link, you can read about it there. Again, I'm trying to keep this on the secular side of things, but be that as it may, so a lot of them were Freemasons, but they were on a social order, okay? If you go to Washington's, the Masonic Museum for George Washington in Washington, D.C., they'll even tell you there, Washington, yeah, he was a Mason, but he didn't really take it that seriously, okay? He was a member, and so he wasn't really involved in it that deeply, okay? So, and let me just say this, that, my main point against this idea that the founders were part of the conspiracy, or America is the new Atlantis, and all this other sort of nonsense, is that they learned in Christian schools, okay, and if we followed the Constitution the way it was written, and we followed the prescription of the founders as they specified that Christianity should be the overwhelming majority, should be the religion of the United States, the one world order stops dead in its tracks, okay? If we had a sound money system as is specified in the Constitution, the Federal Reserve System doesn't get off the ground, okay? So why did the Federal Reserve System have to go through all that effort of lies and all this sort of thing? It took them, up to 1913 from the nation's founding, but it's illegal according to the Constitution. So the main engine, the fuel that drives the other parts of the so-called conspiracy should not exist. In other words, if we follow the Constitution as prescribed by our Christian founders, the whole one world order conspiracy stops dead in its tracks. So how can you say the founders, they were part of the conspiracy when we don't listen to them? And if we did, the whole conspiracy would fall flat on its face. So it's a ridiculous notion, okay, to say that, and I get it, Ben Franklin, the Hellfire Club, in France, who knows, okay, and I've heard those things, but, actually, this is the New England Primer, okay, and this is the book, the school book that many, people, including the founders, went to school with, all right, and it's right out of it's all biblical, okay? It talks about God, evening prayer, okay? And it goes into Noah's Ark and Adam's fall. It talks about the ABCs, Adam's fall, heaven to find, the Bible mind, okay? It talks about Elijah, okay? It had the Lord's Prayer, okay? This was standard stuff. This was standard book in America's schools, okay? Separation of church and state, you communist scumbags at the ACLU. Separation of church and state, another lie, okay? The American Civil Liberties Union, another lie, okay? Use evolution as its backbone. Separation of church, we can't teach Christianity, we can't have the 10 Commandments in school anymore. Communists found it, and I mean that literally, ACLU. So another lie. So I just want to read, here's another book called The Original 13 from William Federer, okay? And I'm just going to read some quotes from George Washington here, all right? The general hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor so to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier defending the rights and liberties of his country, okay? To the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of Christian, okay? There's a quote from George Washington, right? The Freemason, okay, yeah, right. And then the rallying cry of the committees of correspondence, okay, and the Minutemen, no king but King Jesus, okay, that was the rallying cry. Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, okay, from Massachusetts, cousin to John Adams, okay, the second president, major founder of the nation, okay. And again, I'm not saying these men are perfect, okay, but to say that Christianity was, these founders weren't Christians, they were deists or some other nonsense, it doesn't fit with the historical record, okay. And here is, and I'm just going to read out of this book, The Original 13, okay, very well documented, well put together book. It goes through all the constitutions of all the original 13 colonies. But I just picked out a few excerpts here to read. This is the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, written by John Adams, okay, cousin to Sam Adams, all right, father of the Constitution, June 15, 1780. We therefore, the people of Massachusetts, acknowledging with grateful hearts the goodness of the great legislator of the universe, in affording us in the course of his providence an opportunity liberally and peaceably without fraud, violence, or surprise, entering into an original, explicit, and solemn compact. Okay, there's more here. Okay, therefore, a legislature shall from time to time authorize and require the several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies, politics, or religious societies to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of public worship of God. Okay, this is written by John Adams. Okay, the founders were deists, and right, their separation of church and state, right, ACLU, right, and every denomination of Christians demeaning themselves peaceably as good subjects to the Commonwealth shall equally be under the protection of the law. Okay, now we have the Homeland Security called Christians terrorists, right? I'm a terrorist, right? Okay, so oaths and subscriptions, incompatibility, chapter 6, okay, This is what it takes. Any person chosen governor, lieutenant governor, councilor, senator, or representative of court accepting the choice shall, before he proceed to execute the duties of his place or office, make and subscribe the following declaration. I, A.B., do declare that I believe the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of its truth, and that I am seized and possessed in my own right of the property required by the Constitution as one qualification for the office for which I am elected. That's the Constitution of Massachusetts, written by founding father John Adams. I mean, I'm reading it, okay? So all you gotta do is read. Okay, this is what they want you watching TV. They want you watching Fox News and CNN and all this fake Trumpian versus the Democrats government shutdown crap. This two-party circle jerk dance they call politics and elections. But the Federal Reserve System doesn't change, the debt keeps going up, right? DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, right? Cut like what, $1 billion? Government's like $37 trillion in debt, and Hannity's out there shooting his mouth off because they saved like $100 billion. Anyway, so New York Supreme Court, here's a case from 1811, New York Supreme Court, People versus Ruggles. Okay, and what happened was a guy was out, like the ACLU today, was out, blaspheming. Well, I'll read right from here. This was indeed, the defendant was indicted in the presence and hearing of diverse good and Christian people and concerning Christian religion of reporting and concerning Jesus Christ, false, scandalous, malicious, wicked, and blasphemous words following. And they quote this guy that was on trial. Jesus Christ was a bastard and his mother must be a whore in contempt of the Christian religion. Okay, so they put this guy on. So the founders, they prescribed Christianity. They said limited government. The only way it could work is that the people had to govern themselves. They had to be in control of themselves, okay? And charity, that's where real charity comes from, okay? People helping each other, okay? So when Hillary Clinton talks about the compassion of government, okay, yeah, the compassion that the thugs at the IRS and the business end of it done. That's mandatory compassion. That's compassion according to the liberals. But anyway, so this is again, Chief Justice Chancellor Kent delivered the decision, okay, and I'll just read the conclusion again on this case, to construe it as breaking down the common morals barriers against licentiousness, wanton and impious attacks upon Christianity itself would be an enormous perversion of its meaning. Christianity, in its enlarged sense as a religion revealed and taught in the Bible, is not unknown to our law. The court accordingly of opinion that the judgment must be affirmed. And the judgment was, I think he was fined like $500 and imprisoned for 3 months. Okay. New York Supreme Court, People versus Ruggles. This is what the founders believed, okay? This is what they prescribed. And again, I'm not saying they were perfect, okay? But they knew that the government had to stay small. For the government to stay small, it had to be based on something. It could be based on atheism, because atheism leads to people like Charles Darwin, Adolf Hitler, Mao, and Stalin. Okay, they were against Roman Catholicism. Some were Roman Catholics, but they didn't like what they called Popism, which is the Roman Catholic Church, which really was the fusion of church and state over in Europe for 1,000 years or so. And they wanted to get away from that. Okay, and by the way, this separation of church and state scam brought to us by the communist scumbags at the ACLU is another scam. Okay, Jefferson wrote down a letter to Danbury, Connecticut Baptist, and he said the Christian religion would never be illegal in the United States, and there's a wall of separation between the government and the state. What he was referring to was Popism or the Roman Catholicism and the control that they had in Europe, of the governments in Europe. It wasn't referring to getting rid of Christianity, as I just read. And those are just, look, the original 13, that's just one book. Okay, David Barton at wolfbuilders.com has some great information, okay, if you need further resources. But I just read a couple excerpts, okay, just to give you the flavor of what this nation was at its founding. Okay, so by eviscerating the Christian religion, by the atheistic, communist, Darwinist at the ACLU, look where we are now. They took away prayer in schools because of the separation of church and state. That's a scam. Look where we are: suicide, racial strife, endless debt, endless wars, disease, sexually transmitted diseases, mass shootings. Anyway, so that's your 4 horsemen of the American apocalypse, okay? So moving on. So we talked about the Un-American Genocidal Complex. There it is again. Everything is a lie. See, subliminal message, and I know it's backward, and I apologize, but they live. Okay, so moving on. Now, let's talk about the subtitle of my book, The Great Society, okay? Now, as I mentioned, I alluded to it before, they blew JFK's head off in broad daylight because he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve System and get us out of the Vietnam War and the CIA and all that. But what happened right after he died was Lyndon Baines Johnson, okay, white American liberal, okay, brought us the Great Society, okay? Well, basically, was that welfare payments and government dependency. And I've read this quote many times that Lyndon Johnson said, "I'll have these N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years by signing this legislation." And they referred to blacks as uppity Negroes. Now, where did we see that language before? Oh yeah, Margaret Sanger, founder of the Negro Project, the American Birth Control League, Planned Parenthood, that white liberal Democrats, and now they're black liberal sellouts and bootlickers advocate as part of the white liberal Democratic Party. So you can see it's all a scam, okay? But I'm the racist, okay? Anyway, so what it would result in is the destruction of the black community, okay? And this is by design, okay? And the conclusion I come to, and I can come to no other logical conclusion, is that the Great Society wasn't about helping black people. Look what it's done, okay? Now look, I get it, civil rights, and the Ku Klux Klan and all that. By the way, just as an aside, the Ku Klux Klan and the anti-civil rights movement, going back all the way back to the Dred Scott decision before the Civil War, where blacks were considered property, was all Democrats, okay? The KKK is a Democrat institution, okay? The Democrat fought against the Civil Rights Act, 1875, 1964, there's a whole history, okay? But then they switched, okay? They switched to the Great Society with Lyndon Baines Johnson. And racism and the KKK and civil rights and all that aside, brought to us by Democrats, the black community was Christian families. What's happened since then? Okay, what do you have, like a 75% illegitimacy rate in the black community, abortion clinics in the black neighborhoods, this endless welfare dependency on mother government, okay, despair. That's the Great Society. What's so great about that? Well, nothing. But what I'm saying is that was done on purpose, okay? And it's a test case for the Great Reset, okay? Again, I'll say it again, when you see that word great in front of something, the Great Depression, the Great War, and this is covered in section 3 of my first book, They Live, Great Society of the Undead. That's why I put it in quotes, okay? There's something much more nefarious behind the scenes, okay? That word great is evil, okay? So when you see the word great, don't walk, run, okay? But what has the Great Society done? Again, so what I'm saying, in other words, is the black community in America is some kind of vast sociological experiment as to what will happen. What can we do to control people to make them dependent on the government and dependent on government welfare? That's what and it's achieved those goals for the most part, okay? And that's what it's done, okay? What is it, like 90% of the black community votes Democrat? Lyndon Baines Johnson, was he wrong? This is evil, okay? So we're getting to the core of evil here, okay? But this is what's really going on. But then they'll deflect, okay? And they'll say Christians and this and that, or the racists, and I don't want to go back and the scent of man, Anyway, they invent stupid terms to keep us divided. See, they keep us divided. They keep everybody at each other's throats, black against white, young against old, Social Security, another scam, okay? to keep the focus off them, the real core of the problem. Okay. So you have that, okay? So what is the great, just to get into the Great Society, which is segueing into the Great Reset, okay? Let's just go back in history a little bit. I mentioned the Illuminati, the American Illuminati, the Skull and Bones, okay? So the Illuminati, what do they advocate? And they were a historical group, by the way. They were founded back in 1776, and we'll get a little more on that date in a minute. But what do they advocate? Abolition of private property, the destruction of family, the destruction of religion, the destruction of national borders. Does that sound familiar? Okay. And they were financed, okay, by the Rothschild family, okay? So remember I mentioned before about how communism and Hitler and all these other people, all these other despots and genocidal maniacs of world history were financed by the biggest, most evil white bankers, okay, the most evil people in history, okay? This is the foundation of the philosophy of communism brought to us by the Rothschild family in Europe, okay? And what they did is they infiltrated Freemason lodges, because the framework of Freemasonry, and they became ingrained into the Freemasons. That's why they this inner core of Freemasons, not the outer core that you see, in every town, a lodge in every town, all that sort of thing. So that's your Illuminati, okay? And the American Illuminati, again, Skull and Bones, 322, okay? So, and this is the Communist Manifesto, okay? Again, Karl Marx, okay, abolition of private property, heavy income tax, abolition of rights of inheritance, inheritance tax, centralization of credit in a national bank. That's a very important one, okay? Because Lenin, okay, not John Lennon, okay, Vladimir Lenin, American revolutionary financed here in the United States and England, the revolutionary, right? He said the easiest way to take down a capitalist system was to abolish the currency. And how do you abolish the currency? Well, you create a Federal Reserve Bank that's not Federal Reserves, and you print money out of nothing and dilute the currency, okay? The schmucks in Washington call it quantitative easing, but the suckers out here and the imbecile majority call it inflation and eventually hyperinflation, abolishing the currency, okay? Government ownership of production and control of the soil, okay? So, Trump is buying, right? Federal Reserve is buying all these companies, okay? Trump is in on this too, right? Let's just cut the crap. He's done a few good things with the global warming and shutting the borders, but overall, he's part of the two-party circle jerk system as well, the Hannity Fox News versus the CNN liberals. But anyway, so you can see the Communist Manifesto marching forward, okay, matching the goals of the Illuminati, which just so happens to match a lot of the goals of the Great Society, which we just talked about, okay? So, moving on. So what do we have? Oh, here's a fun one. Now, just to kind of tie this all together, okay, but I have something called, this is posted on top of my website, it's called the 1984 link, or the Rockefeller game, as I like to call it, okay? And what I did is I just listed everything in Orwell's 1984 in parallel with the Communist Manifesto, and I traced it, where does it all come from? It all traces back, to our white Illuminati overlords, like the Rockefeller clan. So you can go to the radical feminist movement, the radical homosexual movement, the Federal Reserve, of course, all this other stuff, okay, it was all founded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It's all documented, okay? I know, I'm going to be a homophobe and all this other, whatever, but what has it done? Again, the homosexuals are privy to God's salvation like anybody else. I'm not condemning them, but they need to come to God. But anyway, but what is the radical homosexual movement? What has it done? It's destroyed the family, along with the radical feminism. Destroyed the family, okay? Destroyed the church. Free speech, now we have hate laws, hate speech, right? And it's over-sexualized the country, destroyed marriage. So all these goals of the Illuminati are reflected in the radical homosexual movement, funded and founded by the Rockefeller Foundation through a maniac called Alfred Kinsey, okay, a pedophile, okay, and this sort of thing, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Alfred Kinsey, you can Google his name, and he was he was a pedophile, okay, his experiments, he was a sick man, but who was he funded by? The Rockefeller Foundation. So, our overlords have got themselves really a big bang for their buck, so to speak, okay? You have the destruction of free speech, the destruction of family, the destruction of religion, all coming out of these movements. So it's not an accident, okay? These aren't stupid people, okay? They're pure evil, okay? Adolf Hitler wasn't stupid. Stalin wasn't stupid. They're just evil, demonic. I don't know what else to say, okay, at this point. Genocidal. Okay, so you can go read through that link, and again, as everything on my website, it's fully documented. The footnotes are there, the bibliography's there. Amazon, you can just buy the stuff on Amazon.com as I have done. I mean, I don't have access to any top secret information. I just put things together. But anyway, so you have that. So we're almost at the end here. So you have that, little fun fact. And let's talk about significant days, because this is something that I don't really hear anybody, I haven't heard my fellow conspiracy theorists talk about this. So what dates do we have, okay? We have March 22nd, 322. Okay, and where do we see 322? Okay, it's the spring equinox. It's also the number on the Skull and Bones logo, okay? So Skull and Bones, 322. Where does it also show up? But on these Georgia Guidestones, okay? Which, as I mentioned before, were brought to us by a mysterious man by the name of Robert Christian, calling for world government, the destruction of politics, the destruction of national borders, okay, the elimination of God and the age of reason, and a reduction of 90% in the world's population. Okay, so where have you been reading about all that? We've been reading about it for the last hour or so. Okay, so you have 323, March 22nd, a very significant date. Okay, that lines up. Okay, I don't believe that's a coincidence. Okay, then you have the next date, significant date that I would talk about is May 1st. Okay, now what is May 1st? It's the founding of the Illuminati, the Bavarian Illuminati, which we discussed a few minutes ago, back in 1776. It's also World Workers' Day. Okay, it was celebrated by the Communists in the Soviet Union. May 1st, okay, it's associated with something called the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, where radicals in the late 1800s, okay, liberals, the forerunners to today's liberals and terrorists like William Ayres, okay, the Weather Underground, if you're familiar with them. World Workers' Day is May 1st, okay, so you got the foundation of the Illuminati, who espoused basically communism, gave us the principles of communism, founded on the same day as World Workers' Day, and what else? Beltane, okay, which is a holiday that the Gaia Earth worship weirdos consider sacred, okay? It's based on the goddess Maya, okay, the whore goddess Isis, okay? They all go around, all these weirdos go around and dance around maypoles and whatever, and, Burning Man out in the desert, whatever they do. But May Day is also May 1st, so it's a holiday for the radical environmental movement. But as I mentioned before, things like the Earth Summit and this sort of thing, tied in with the climate change scam, it's really about Earth worship, okay? And again, Gaia is another name for the whore goddess Isis. Going back to the Old Testament, Israel went a-whoring after the gods and goddesses of their surrounding nations, Egypt, Canaan, Phoenicia, the Philistines, this sort of thing. So again, as I mentioned, it's hard to separate the secular from the conspiratorial, or the religious or the biblical side of things. So, and you can see it with things tied up in things like, the holiday May 1st, celebrated across many different spectrums, okay? So you have that. So, and let's just kind of take this from another angle. Let's just tie this all together. Mass genocide for the last 200 years, okay? So we talked about Darwinism and social Darwinism, right? And that led to communism, the Nazis, eugenics / abortion. Okay, abortion again, I think I mentioned it's about 70 million and counting in this nation. And if you take it worldwide, international Planned Parenthood, I think it's in the neighborhood of 1 billion. So the Rockefeller people and the other ones that supported Margaret Sanger and Adolf Hitler have gotten a big bang for their bucks through the eugenics and the abortion movement in terms of mass genocide as specified in the Georgia Guidestones. Okay, and then of course that ties into radical environmentalism. Okay, these people are shot. Okay, again, worshiping the created, Romans chapter 1, over the creator. Okay, by calling Gaia the mother goddess. And by the way, the maypole, just as an aside, and again, I'm getting into the second session I'm going to do in a few weeks here, but you know, it's associated with the phallus of Osiris, the dead god, the Egyptian sun god Ra. Okay, that's the maypole, the phallus of Osiris, the whore goddess Gaia, Isis, get it, Ahoran, Old Testament. Okay, I don't want to go off on a tangent right now, but all this stuff ultimately connects. And I'll say it again, this is why I say the Bible lies at the core of the so-called conspiracy. Okay, but anyway, so we're gonna try and wrap this up here. So you got the movements of mass genocide. I just repackaged it, you know, kind of summarized it, everything we talked about. So I'm gonna conclude with this, okay? So I mentioned before, I called New York City Mystery Babylon, and I have no doubt, and there's a whole link, okay, Mystery Babylon USA, you can go read, and I'll cover that in a future session, but if you want to go ahead again and read the Mystery Babylon USA link. Just based on what this nation has started as a Christian nation, which we talked about, okay, to devolve into what it is today in 2025, from you know, no king but King Jesus, to Margaret Sanger's Negro Project, and the endless wars and the genocide and Hitler, and now in Scotland and Darwinism, all coming from this country. There's no way, okay, there's no other candidate for Mystery Babylon, in other words, is what I'm saying, okay? And we're gonna get to this more in detail. Now, I'll just say this, you know, the candidates I see are Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, you know, sits on 7 hills. Hills are kingdoms, okay, they're not physical hills. Saudi Arabia, okay, Babylon and Iraq. I even see national Israel and Jerusalem as a candidate. No, nothing in terms of where we've gone as a nation, as a Christian nation, to where we are today. You know, Hebrews chapter 2, you know, how can we neglect so great a salvation as Jesus Christ? So a nation founded on the principles of Christianity and Jesus Christ, to where we are today, a debt-ridden, warmongering, abortion, radical environmental nation. You know, I say New York City, USA, okay, for Mystery Babylon, and that does not bode well, okay? And I don't want to get into that. I know it's, you know, God's simple salvation plan is again, I'll say it again, but, you know, and I say that with the utmost regret and really sadness to say this, okay? You know, again, this is not the rapture cult and all this other crap, you know, oh yeah, Israel, we're gonna get raptured out of here. This is bad stuff, okay? I'm remiss to discuss it, but I feel like I have to, and we'll get to that in the next session. So, but if you want to go ahead and read, the Mystery Babylon USA link is on there. It's an ebook. Again, it's a PDF. You're on the honor system. There's a link, $5 I think I charge. You can do it PayPal. You can snail me a check, or you know. So that's it. I mean, you know, we'll talk about, you know, that kind of wraps things up, and then I'll just, you know, biblical end times, okay, this kind of segues into the next session, okay. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'll just spend a minute on here. I want to wrap this up, but national Israel and Zionism, okay, let's just cut the crap with God's chosen people, all right. The Star of David, so-called, has nothing to do with King David, okay. It's emblematic of the phallus of Osiris, which I just mentioned, is the same thing as the maypole or the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, Washington's monument, which came about after George Washington, by the way. I know people, oh, George Washington, Freemason, conspiracy. No, a lot of the stuff with George Washington came out years after he died, all right? Anyway, so national Israel Zionism. The point is that these 6-point star, it's a hexagram, it's demonic, okay? It's emblematic of the downward pointing triangle, emblematic of the birth canal or vagina of the whore goddess Gaius or Isis, and the upward triangle is emblematic of the maypole or the phallus of the dead god Osiris. Okay, and this gets into the whole Freemasonry, and we'll discuss that in the future, but the point is that these idiots, these Christian Zionists, okay, that think they're supporting God's chosen people, waving around the flag of Israel, they have no idea what they're it's idolatry. This is the book of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah, whoring. This is, I'm almost at a loss for words at how stupid these people are. John Hagee and the like, and even Donald Trump. We must support Israel. Ted Cruz, I saw his thing with Tucker Carlson. We gotta support Israel. New Testament, book of Galatians, Romans, Jesus' words himself. Ye are your father the devil, talking to the Pharisees, the Jewish Pharisees. You have your father the devil? I mean, how do you misinterpret that? He's talking about the Jews leaders who would eventually convince the people of Jerusalem to crucify Jesus. This is God's chosen people? I mean, come on. And again, and I don't want to be like anti-Semite, which Semites are. It's not Semitic people, okay? The white European Jews are in most of Israel right now. Semites are the Philistines. But anyway, that's a whole joke. But anyway, again, I'm going off on a tangent. I apologize. But anyway, it's a joke, okay? But I will say this, okay? I'm not going to say it's a Jewish banking conspiracy. You know, again, I said the Rockefeller name. They were supposedly Protestant, so the Jews. It's not just the Jewish only things. I'm not being prejudiced against Jews. I'm just objectively stating what's in the Bible. Okay, but Jews are privy to God's salvation, like anybody else. Okay, so I'm not casting them off. I'm not saying they're evil or satanic. I've seen that satanic Jews. If you look at Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 3. The Apostle Paul himself was a Pharisee. He was redeemed with most of the New Testament. So they're privy to being redeemed and you know, redeemed sinners like the rest of us, okay? But they have to be redeemed, okay? To worship a people, we talk about a respecter of persons. I mean, 1 Peter chapter 2, God's not a respecter of persons. You're idolizing a nation and a hexagram, Christian Zionists. So anyway, we'll get more into that. We get into biblical symbolism, numbers. Okay, this is what nobody talks about. These people that center on Israel as the focal point of biblical prophecy, which I just said is not, it's the United States. They don't talk about the biblical symbolism of numbers. Okay, very simple. We'll get into that. Mythology. Okay, that ties into all this. You know, the gods of mythology ties into things like Genesis 6. These sons of God coming into daughters of men, angels interbreeding with humans. Okay. Steve Quayle, I can't approach his work, but Steve Quayle, stevequayle.com. I have no affiliation. I subscribe to his stuff, but I have no affiliation with him. He does some excellent work on mythology and the ancient gods. The Freemasons, we'll talk about them. The mysterious Robert Christian, okay? And again, there's another ebook. I have an ebook on my site. You can read that. Okay, chapters and chapters about the mysterious Robert Christian, founded with the Georgia Guidestones, but that name goes back centuries. I promise you, okay, you can read all about that. We'll talk about that more. The word great, what it really means, we talked about it. I mentioned it briefly, what it really means to our overlords. And we'll conclude with Mystery Babylon USA. That'll be in the next session. So anyways, hopefully, you know, I apologize. I know I go off on tangents. I try to keep it as organized as possible, but there's a lot of information that's out there. And really, I barely scratched the surface, even in my books. You know, I barely scratched the surface, but there's enough there to make the case. And again, I'll conclude where I started, you know, boxofsunglasses.com, God's Simple Salvation Plan. God bless everyone that's listening, and hopefully this makes sense on some kind of level and gives you a better idea to understand what's really going on in the world, the reality of Jesus Christ, and all of our needs. That we need the Savior, that we all need to be redeemed. All humanity is one family. So I'll conclude with that, and good day and God bless.